Imagine, just for a second, walking into a gross anatomy lab. You're tracing the trigeminal nerve, you're examining the incredibly dense bone of a human jaw, looking at the exact mechanical articulation of the temporomandibular joint.
Right, a highly grounded, very empirical space.
Exactly. It is a space of absolute, undeniable physical reality. You're mapping fixed biological territory. But now, imagine that literal, grinding bone is actually the fundamental engine of divine revelation. Welcome to the debate. Today we are exploring a collision of worlds that, rarely share a syllabus.
And what a massive collision it is. I mean, you take the heavily clinical world of dentistry and medical anatomy, and you crash it head-on into the abstract, metaphysical deconstruction of a philosophy seminar.
It's wild. So today's discussion focuses on a truly fascinating and genuinely radical thesis, presented in the recent text, Ezekiel and Dentistry, published by the NLM.
Yes.
This text fundamentally reinterprets the ancient mystical visions of the prophet Ezekiel, but through the dual lenses of clinical anatomy and philosophy. For the students of medicine and philosophy joining us today, we are going to deeply analyze this theory, exploring exactly how biomechanics and metaphysics collide.
It's such a rich text.
It really is, and we have a central question to unpack here. Does this theory argue that rigid, physical anatomical structure is the fundamental engine that actually produces meaning? Or is this elaborate anatomical analogy merely a vehicle to explain a deeply philosophical desire to destroy structure and escape language entirely?
It is a profound tension. And look, if you are listening to this and wondering how on earth an ancient biblical text about angels and wheels translates to a human molar, well, you aren't alone. But the way this author maps it out is it's nothing short of breathtaking.
I completely agree, and I firmly believe this text is a triumph of biological embeddedness. My position today is that the physical anatomy, specifically the jaw and the kinetic system of the molars, is the literal mechanism that creates meaning through physical contact and pressure. Anatomy isn't just a metaphor here, it is the absolute foundation of the vision.
Well, I come at it from a slightly different way. While the anatomical mapping is undeniably brilliant, I argue that the true core of this thesis is what the text calls the reversal of mediation.
Okay, meaning what?
Meaning those physical structures only exist in this framework to collapse form. The ultimate goal isn't mechanical digestion, it's a metaphysical return, bringing revelation back to an unstructured, pre-linguistic vibration.
Interesting. Well, let's lay out our positions a bit more fully. I want to start by looking at what the text calls the first movement. If you read this through the eyes of a medical student or a philosopher of biology, the dominant philosophy of the text is undeniably structural.
Right, it establishes the groundwork.
Yes, it takes Ezekiel's famous four living creatures, which thousands of years of theology have treated as ethereal, floating angels with four faces, and it maps them directly to the human mouth. It says, no, these aren't floating entities. They are the four molars embedded in the earth of the human jawbone.
Right. It grounds the transcendent completely into the highly localized, incredibly dense tissue of the mouth.
Exactly. And it states that their apparent transcendence is actually their embeddedness in a functional geometry of chewing. This is crucial. It proves that meaning in this framework is not observed from afar like a painting on a wall. It's produced through contact and pressure.
But is it though?
I think it is. The text even uses Ezekiel's famous wheel within a wheel concept to explain the active socket and tooth dynamic. You know how a tooth isn't just statically glued into a jaw, but held by periodontal ligaments that allow for these microscopic rotational movements under immense pressure?
Yes, the biomechanics are spot on.
Right, so to me, this asserts that the body is the ultimate philosophical machine. Perception, digestion, and meaning are inherently fused into a coordinated intelligence of matter.
Okay, the first movement certainly does an astonishing job of grounding the ethereal in the biological. I don't deny the elegance of that mapping at all, but I must counter by focusing on the second movement of the text, because that is where the true purpose of this entire system is finally revealed.
Go on.
Well, I acknowledge the brilliance of the anatomical mapping, but I argue it is completely subservient to a much more radical philosophical goal. And that goal is the absolute refusal of intermediary structures.
How so? Because the structures are so meticulously detailed.
They are, but look at what actually happens in the narrative. Ezekiel doesn't just sit there flexing his jaw. He eats a scroll, a written document. The text explicitly describes this as a deliberate attempt to reverse the descent of the divine voice into written language.
Right, the Scroll of Lamentations.
Exactly. Fundamentally, this text is about epistemology. It's asking the root question of how we actually know what we know. It asks whether knowledge requires a physical structure, like a word on a page, to exist. The ultimate goal of those molars isn't to chew just to sustain the biological organism.
Then what is it?
The goal is to undo the distance that was introduced the moment a voice became a text. It is an active moving backward from the fixed sign, the written word on the scroll, to pure sound and vibration.
Okay, that brings us right to the heart of the debate, really. Architecture versus the rejection of form. Let's dive into the specific anatomy detailed in the text, because I think the sheer mechanical detail proves why structure remains paramount here.
I'm listening.
The author doesn't just lazily say teeth. They detail the mapping of the 4 faces of Ezekiel's angels to the literal dimensions of a molar cube.
It is incredibly specific.
Very. You have the occlusal surface, that top head where the actual grinding occurs. Then you have the functional faces oriented toward the cheek, the tongue, and the adjacent teeth. The text describes how the wings touching each other in the biblical vision represent the interlocking contact points between neighboring teeth.
Where the pressure is distributed, right?
Exactly, where pressure is shared across the dental arch. If you are a medical student studying biomechanics, you know that force must be distributed across the whole dental structure to prevent a single tooth from shattering or dislocating the jaw.
Sure, the system relies on its neighbors.
Right. I would argue this is a direct, inescapable analogy for philosophy. Philosophical meaning requires a rigid relational framework to be processed without dislocating our grasp on reality.
Well, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. That beautiful structural symmetry you just outlined, the wings touching the distributed force, it is immediately betrayed by the very act of eating the scroll.
Wait, betrayed? How?
Because if structure is so perfect, if the anatomical framework is the ultimate producer of meaning, why does the text explicitly define writing and speech as a descent?
A descent from what exactly?
From the pure, unmediated divine voice. The text calls written language a hardening. A word on a page is frozen. It's a dead artifact of what was once a live, resonant voice. The text is highly critical of that hardened structure.
But he uses the structure to consume it.
Yes, but the entire molar framework, all those beautiful occlusal surfaces and interlocking wings you just mentioned, they only exist to violently break down external objects. The architecture is a demolition mechanism. The prophet uses the teeth to destroy the inscription so he can escape structure entirely. He wants to thaw the frozen artifact back into raw sound.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, mostly because you are treating the destruction of the scroll as a pure annihilation of meaning rather than a translation of meaning into a biologically integrated form.
Translation? I don't see it that way.
Think about the physiological reality of digestion. You don't just destroy an apple to make it disappear into a void, right? You break it down so it can become part of the cellular structure of the organism. You assimilate it.
True, in a literal digestive sense.
Right, and the text describes the body processing its own world. The structural integrity of the jaw is what makes that assimilation possible. It takes the external and makes it deeply, fundamentally internal.
But the text literally says he is trying to collapse this chain backward. He isn't trying to build up his own cellular biology. He is pulling revelation backward toward its pre-linguistic origin, where meaning is still vibration rather than fixed form.
So,
let me just add, digestion in the biological sense builds the physical body, yes, but digestion in this epistemological sense is about dismantling the physical signifier. It's a profound refusal. He is no longer satisfied with receiving meaning through written exteriority. He hates the scroll because it is a scroll.
Okay, let's examine the actual phenomenological experience of that digestion then. What it physically feels like for the prophet. The text introduces the paradox of the scroll being both sweet and bitter in his mouth and stomach.
Yes, a very famous passage.
I argue that this duality inherently proves the necessity of the physical body in processing truth. The text states it is sweet because the contact with the origin is immediate, but it is bitter because the collapse of mediation destabilizes the ordered world of distinction and sequence. The world stops making logical, grammatical sense.
Which is exactly my point.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. Go ahead.
This destabilization isn't about escaping the physical form. The text explicitly says the scroll is returned to the body so that the body itself can become a resonant chamber.
A resonant chamber. Yes, think about the mechanics of a guitar, or a drum, or even the human vocal cords. A resonant chamber requires walls. It requires structure. You cannot have acoustics in a vacuum. The physical body is elevated here. It isn't discarded. The enamel, the jawbone, the tension of the muscles, they provide the walls for the divine frequency to echo against.
Well, how can you claim this is about physical embeddedness when the text explicitly states the prophet is trying to tune his entire being to the frequency of the divine utterance before it becomes fragmented into language? Let's unpack that for a second.
Okay.
For the philosophy students listening, this is a textbook illustration of collapsing mediation to reach a pre-linguistic origin. The body isn't processing the world in a functional, empirical sense anymore. It is trying to transcend the sequence and grammar of the world entirely.
But why is grammar something to be transcended? I mean, why see it as a negative?
Because grammar is a trap. Grammar forces a thought into a linear sequence. Subject, verb, object. It forces time. It forces division. The sweetness of the scroll is the nearness to the unmediated divine, a space where everything is understood instantly, all at once, without the trap of syntax.
And the bitterness?
The bitterness is the realization that he still exists in a world of distinction, a world of molars and jaws and language and time. The bitterness is the gravity of the physical world pulling him back down.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. When you say the body is trying to transcend the sequence and grammar of the world, I think you are falling back into the very dualism the text is trying to cure.
How so?
You're separating the mind's desire from the body's reality. The text says Ezekiel is attempting to tune his entire being to that frequency. The tuning mechanism is the body. You cannot have a resonant chamber without the density of bone, the specific tension of the muscle, the exact architecture of the temporomandibular joint.
But the joint is just the instrument, not the music.
But the vibration doesn't exist out in the ether. It requires a medium. The text forces us to see that the divine utterance relies on the biomechanics of the jaw to be realized on earth.
That is a compelling argument, but have you considered that a medium by definition is something you pass through to get to the destination? A wire carries electricity, but the wire isn't the light bulb?
Fair, but
This syntax of the mouth. The prophet wants to go before that. He wants the absolute origin. The biological machinery is a tragic necessity of his mortal condition, not the idealized state of the revelation.
But look, he doesn't just sit in a cave and hear a voice. He has to physically act. Let's look at the text's conclusion regarding Ezekiel's progressive calibration. It talks about his symbolic gestures, his enacted silences, his increasingly compressed prophetic performances. He binds himself. He lies on his side for hundreds of days.
True, the actions are extreme.
They are, and I claim that this prophetic poetics is the ultimate synthesis for medicine and philosophy. The text says action itself becomes utterance. Think about what that means mechanically and philosophically.
It means the words fail him.
or it means the words are superseded by the physical form. The physical movements of the body are the meaning. Look at how modern humans process information today. We digest data physically. We hold stress in our jaws. We grind our teeth at night when our minds are overwhelmed by the sequence of our lives.
Oh, Brooksism as a philosophical response.
Exactly. The kinetic system of the jaw and the body cannot be separated from the processing of reality. The action doesn't point to the meaning like a signpost. The action is the meaning.
You are stopping one sentence too short in the text. Yes, action becomes utterance, but the very next clause says that utterance becomes indistinguishable from the source it once mediated. Let me offer an analogy to clarify how I see this and why I believe the physical structure is ultimately left behind.
Think about a tuning fork.
Okay, a tuning fork.
When you strike a tuning fork, you need the physical structure of the metal. You need the two prongs, the stem, the specific alloy, and the exact mass. That is your anatomy. That is your molar cube. But once it vibrates perfectly, once it hits that pure 440 hertz resonance, what happens to your perception of the fork?
The sound overtakes it.
Exactly. You no longer notice the metal. If you close your eyes, there is only the vibration. The physical object vanishes into the phenomenological experience of the sound. It ceases to be an object and becomes an event.
Wow, okay.
Right? The anatomical structure of the jaw, the heavy bone, the enamel, it ultimately renders itself obsolete once that pre-linguistic threshold is crossed. The prophet becomes pure frequency. The metal is forgotten.
That's a beautiful image. Let me sit with that for a second. Okay, I appreciate the tuning fork analogy, but I actually think it proves my point.
How could it?
Because the metal doesn't cease to exist just because you close your eyes and focus on the sound. If you remove the metal, the sound stops instantly. The vibration is a property of the physical structure in motion.
Phenomenologically, the object is gone, though.
But physically, it's doing all the work. The text says he is learning to operate at the threshold where meaning is no longer spoken about but enacted directly. Enactment requires an actor. It requires the physical stage of the jaw. By saying the utterance becomes indistinguishable from the source, the text isn't saying the body disappears. It is saying the body is elevated to the status of the divine source. The biological is deified.
I disagree that the biological is deified. I think the biological is consumed. It's a self-immolating process. The bitterness of the scroll is the realization that the body is a temporary failing vessel. The text says writing and speech are a descent.
Yes, why would the physical body, which is even denser, more vulnerable, and more fixed than speech, be the ultimate triumph? It is merely the tool used to undo the trap of language. He uses the teeth to grind the language into dust, to bypass the intellect and the external sign, and return the signal to the internal void.
But look at the precision with which the author of this text maps that void. They don't use abstract terms. They don't use loose, poetic metaphors about light and dark. They use the socket and tooth dynamic. They talk about rotation like micro-adjustments.
Because that's the reality of the cage.
But the author clearly reveres the biological mechanism. If the goal was simply metaphysical escape, there would be no need to explicitly map the four faces of the angel to the occlusal, cheek, tongue, and adjacent surfaces of the tooth. The author is demanding that we as readers look at the literal biological tissue.
They map it meticulously because they are showing how deep the trap of mediation goes. They are showing us the bars of the cage. The coordinated intelligence of matter processing its own world is exactly that. It's matter trapped in the material world, processing other matter.
Right.
The prophet's profound tragedy and his radical solution is to turn that beautiful, intricate machinery against the very concept of external meaning. He eats the book to destroy the book.
Well, as we draw this discussion toward a close, I want to summarize where we stand because we've covered incredible ground between the anatomy lab and the philosophy seminar.
We really have.
I maintain that this NLM text offers a profound medical philosophical paradigm. It demands that we view anatomy, the jaw, the molars, the physics of contact and pressure, as the literal engine that processes the divine. It refuses to let philosophy float in the clouds. It grounds meaning in the hard enamel and the periodontal ligaments. It is a triumph of biological reality over abstract escapism. Meaning isn't found by escaping the body. It's found by chewing through the material of the world.
And I maintain that the text is ultimately a metaphysical thesis about escaping the tyranny of fixed language. The intricate anatomy is acknowledged, yes, but it is utilized as a mechanism of digestive destruction. The goal is to collapse the distance of mediation, the distance between a thought and a spoken word, or a voice and a written text, and return to pure unmediated vibration. The biological structure is the method of undoing, not the final destination.
Yet, despite this fundamental tension in our readings, I think we have reached a vital point of convergence. We both agree that this interpretation radically redefines prophetic vision.
Oh, absolutely. It pulls the mystical vision entirely out of the sky.
It takes the floating, esoteric angels from the heavens and embeds them violently and incredibly intimately within the human body. It says the divine isn't out there. It's in the grinding mechanics of your own skull.
It is a remarkable synthesis, and it highlights the tremendous value of reading ancient, seemingly impenetrable texts through entirely unexpected interdisciplinary lenses. Whether you are a student dedicating your life to dentistry and clinical anatomy, or you are a student of epistemology mapping the limits of human knowledge, this text fundamentally challenges our basic assumptions about how we consume information.
It certainly does. It forces you to ask what happens when the very words you are reading or listening to right now are subjected to the biological machinery of your own comprehension.
Which brings us back to where we started. The next time you find yourself in the anatomy lab looking at the rigid structure of a mandible, or in a seminar questioning the fundamental nature of a text, you have to ask yourself, are your physical interactions with the world the very things that create meaning? Or is all that structure merely a temporary tool, a way to grind down the noise so you can finally feel the underlying vibration? We will leave you to ponder that.